Alrighty. Okay, so today we are going to be going over what I would call the context of the Epic of Gilgamesh. This is, if you started reading it already, probably it would come off to you as a kind of a weird story. It doesn't read like a contemporary piece of fiction or mythology. As I mentioned on Tuesday, it actually structurally can compare to something like Star Wars or the Avengers, but probably when you first read it, it doesn't seem anything like that. At least it didn't to me. But if we jump back in time and use archaeology and anthropology to try to understand what their world was like at the time when Epic of Gilgamesh was first put together, we can start to see the story and look at some of the things that were important to them in their life, their values, their beliefs, in an effort to compare the Epic of Gilgamesh to things like Star Wars, Lord of the Rings, the Avengers, Harry Potter, whatever. We can look at the character Gilgamesh and start to see him as a hero. In the beginning of the story, he does not seem like a hero. But without getting too much further into the story, which we will discuss next Tuesday and Thursday, I'm going to kind of take us back in time to ancient Mesopotamia. So, let me make sure this is working here. If we first.
I have a quick question.
Sure. Question.
I already started my annotations, and with the annotations, I had something to say, and it went as a reply to someone else. Does that count as one of the 5 annotations?
Yes, it will count. It will count. Now, it's
sure.
It's good to put a couple of your own down. Like you don't want to only reply.
Yeah, that's it.
But yes, you can do that. The the software is first and foremost looking to see that you are putting your own down, and then secondly, it will look to see what you're saying to other people. There's another question, Nathaniel.
I also finished my annotations for the reading, but I had an issue where I was coming in as anonymous. Like, I don't know how to get rid of that option to be unanonymous, you know?
Okay, I'll have to take a look at it. It's possible that there's a setting on my end or your end. Um, it, I'll have to look at perusal. If you want to hang around for a minute after class, I can take a look at that with you.
Yeah, that's fine. Thanks.
Okay, and
your comments, Nathaniel. Sorry.
You were able to see them?
I'm able to see what was it? Gianna, and that's all I'm able to see as of right now is Gianna's. Oh wait, maybe these ones are yours. Yeah, anonymous.
Okay. Yeah. Well, thank you for letting us know, Eli. It's possible there's just a setting. Um, I've seen that happen before where I've set assignments to be anonymous, but I've not seen people be anonymous and not anonymous. We'll investigate it together. And keep in mind, I'm not going to grade hard on these first ones. This is like a test run. We're just getting used to using the software. So don't freak out about it. Don't get too stressed. Um, and we'll talk about the annotations. We'll start talking about them on Tuesday. We'll use them as points for discussion and debate. So we will take a look at those together. But anyways, going back in time to the ancient world, the Epic of Gilgamesh is associated with the civilization of Mesopotamia, and a lot of people when they think about ancient civilizations, they think about one city or one culture. There is a lot going on in Mesopotamia. It's more like a place and a vast range of time. And if we look at the place, it's mainly where we find the contemporary country of Iraq. But it also includes, as you can see in the map over here, I've got a little laser pointer. Let me pull that up. It's also Syria, Lebanon, Israel, and this is known to be, by archaeologists, anthropologists, uh, the birthplace of the earliest civilizations, the earliest cities, the earliest places where we find humans settling down and building up a big, kind of complicated city-like society and multiple city-like societies. And archaeologists have questioned why here, why this place? There's so many places in the world, and if you know anything about the environments in Iraq or Israel today, you probably have some picture in your head. Oh, it's kind of dry and desert like there. Why would civilization start there? Well, despite the fact that it's very dry in many of these places, there are some wonderful rivers, the Tigris and Euphrates rivers, that have an annual flood zone where they flood out on a yearly basis. They run through the country here. You can see on my blue laser pointer both of these rivers. And when they flood, they spill their banks, they spill fertile soil out all over into an area that we call a floodplain. This is also why Egypt, although very dry, was a good place for civilization to start. They would be able to take advantage of these soils. And another reason why this is a curious but interesting part of human history is because this is where we see agriculture emerge. So it's not surprising that people possibly invent agriculture, and then we see societies grow larger and larger and larger, become more and more complicated. Because agriculture emerges here, we call this area also the Fertile Crescent. The rivers, the birth of agriculture, uh, is the reason why it's got this name. And archaeologists have, for many years, argued, well, how did they invent agriculture? How did they go from hunting and gathering, hunting animals, gathering nuts, berries, and things like that, to spending all this time messing around with plants, working on a farm, working with animals? And the theory is that in this area, when they first moved in, hunter and gatherer peoples are very mobile. They move around, they camp out, they have cycles where they harvest berries or gather berries and nuts and good food, and they move around through their environment in a nomadic fashion. And the argument is that while moving through these areas, stopping to camp, they noticed that there were some spots where there were these little grasses that would grow, that had some small little grain like granules on them, and that they could use. They could gather up and ground and make something kind of like biscuits or bread. And they became very attracted to these things, which were basically proto versions of wheat. And they would come back year after year to these places where these grasses would grow. And they eventually would select the grasses that had more little granules of wheat, and they would take them with them. And somehow along the way, they took them and they realized they could plant them. And year after year, they would plant these things. And they figured out how to take care of them. Give them water. Uh, you would put them this deep in the soil. And they would also choose the plants that put out the most granules of wheat. And year after year, hundreds and hundreds of years pass. They end up doing more or less what we call genetic modification. They selected the plants that were going to give them the most crop each year. And year after year, hundreds of years later, they also got really good at taking care of these plants. So good, in fact, that they would grow more and more as time went on. And they could grow so many that they were able to stop moving around their environment looking for berries, hunting animals, and just focus on these plants and have enough food. But not only have enough food, they would have extra food. They could save and store these things. And this would allow them to have leftover food or stores of food in periods like the winter where there was not much fruits and berries and things like that available. And this also meant that they would have to protect their land. They would have to protect their space because if you have a crop that's producing food, other people can come in and take it. Other animals can come in and take it. And we see because of this, because they've found a valuable resource that they can grow and take care of, that the culture of the Mesopotamians, of these early people, really starts to change, and some important things we'll talk about here in a minute emerge. So jumping into the map, you can really see it here clearly, the Tigris and Euphrates river. So right here's the Tigris River, here's the Euphrates River. So these rivers, they flow down this way towards the Persian Gulf, and they flood all along these floodplains on a yearly basis. And these floodplains were where they were growing these early crops. They would recognize, oh wait, we could plant these things here. The river's going to flood. There's going to be tons and tons that will pop up. Next year, we're going to have a great crop. They got better and better at this over time, and they would divert and create channels off the river so that water could be flowing into their crop area, their fields, throughout the year. And you can see on the map here, there are early cities, early farming villages. It's a little bit hard to see in this map, but we see one over here in Syria, villages. We see them over here, over here. So this is way back in the day. So the Epic of Gilgamesh is the oldest story that people have written down that we have. But the culture of Mesopotamia goes back further than the story itself. It's possible that in the beginning civilization, that people did have a story like the Epic of Gilgamesh or something very similar. So this is 5,000 years before the Common Era to about 600 years. So this is, as I said, a big range of time. We're not just talking about one city rising and falling. We're talking about multiple cities, but dating back 5,000 years before the Common Era, so before Christ. And the first one that we have a pretty good understanding of was Sumeria. And as I mentioned, Mesopotamia was not just home to one civilization, but we have other civilizations that would bump up into civilizations that you may know, like the Greeks, the Romans, much later. But the Akkadians, the Hittites, the Babylonians, Syrians, and Chaldeans. And each one of these cultures adopted agriculture, like I said, but they became better and better and more successful at it. And as they became more and more successful at it, they would build up cities. Lots of people would get together, and people would specialize in kinds of agriculture, but they would also specialize in creating tools, creating art. They had enough food that not everybody needed to be a farmer, enough extra surplus food. And they had enough extra surplus food that some people decided they didn't want to be farmers at all. They wanted to fight and just go take farmers' food. This is maybe a primal instinct of humanity. Some people don't want to work and they'd rather just take things from other people. And they would run in and attack these small farming villages or cities, take as much food as they could, or they take over. So all these cities, and we'll look at a map where we'll see how many there were, would build up walls. They would build up walls like you can imagine, like in the medieval period, like a castle wall that would surround the city. And this was a way for them to protect their people and keep their food. The walls would be around the areas where people would actually live, and the farms would be on the land surrounding the city. So they'd have to bring in their stores of food. And because of this, the successful cities would protect their people, build bigger and bigger walls, and oftentimes they would build armies, and take over other cities, and demand tribute. And at the same time, because people are running around, taking over cities, building walls, we see culture and ideas about the world, about the gods, about life and death being transmitted back and forth throughout these cities, even though some of them were very far apart. We see many of these cities that are blossoming around the Tigris and Euphrates River, having a very similar culture, even though it appears that they had different kings and different armies. And what this means is we actually get a bunch of different versions of the Epic of Gilgamesh, a bunch of kind of similar ones, but almost like it was different, written by different authors with different ideas about what they wanted to express. So when we read the Epic of Gilgamesh, what recent scholars and historians and archaeologists have tried to do, they've tried to put together like a bunch of different versions to try to make one story for us to read. But you have to keep in mind it is a mixture of a bunch of different stories. But this was par for the course in ancient times, and many ancient texts are like this. The Bible, for example, is written by many different people, arguably by different cultures, and kind of all put together for us to read. And people can deal with kind of the differences that exist when you get a bunch of different writers. So we're going to zone in on the Sumerians, the first group that really dominated the region, the ones that did the best in terms of agriculture and producing wealth, but also dominated the region in terms of defending themselves, building big walls and building armies to defend themselves and also take over other cities. In addition to growing crops, they also were able to raise livestock. So we see cattle and goats and sheep, things like that also playing an important role in the society at the time. Because they were able to produce so much food, defend their food, they had a lot of extra. They were able to create these gigantic stores of food for hard times, famine. And in any society, when you get a lot of extra food, you have people that want to trade these extra resources. So we get a merchant class of traders that emerges, and they take the extra food, maybe extra things like gold, uh, um, jewels, and they trade between these cities as a way to try to increase their wealth, increase their standing. And these traders also are spreading culture. They're spreading stories, ideas, beliefs along the way. If we look at the Sumerians, and this is the group that is most associated with these early myths of this King Gilgamesh, we see that they live in a city state. So this is like what you may have heard about the ancient Greeks. This is not a gigantic country like the United States, or Russia, or something like that. They lived in cities where the city itself was the center of the world, but that was the main area where people said, this is my area. This is It was like each city was like a country. Each city, as I mentioned, was walled and fortified. It was surrounded by vast open lands where they would have their farms, farmsteads, and each city was pretty self-sufficient. And each city had a king, usually. And like I mentioned, the Greeks organized their society this way, which we're going to talk about the Greeks later. And also, interestingly, the ancient Maya peoples in the New World, Yucatan, Belize, Honduras, Guatemala, also their uh, their organized themselves politically into city states. Although they were very divided, these peoples, into these little city states. The largest were Uruk, and Lagash. So these ones had more power than others, more wealth, and they could influence these small little satellite cities in important ways. But they had no central government, no king that was or an emperor that ruled over them all. Because of that, any of them was, we say, vulnerable to attack. If there's no one king of them all, one city could get attacked by a raiding band from outside the region, and well, they're not attacking us; they're attacking these other guys, and this means that these city states only have to worry about defending themselves. They had a three level class system, which we see only really emerges after people invent agriculture. So this is pretty simple. This is nobles, middle class, and peasants. The peasants are the people working in the fields. The middle class were often traders, people that maybe owned land. And the nobles, people that owned a lot of land, maybe were trading or had traders working for them. And the people that also owned a lot of weapons and maybe even hired mercenaries to defend their lands. So all these cities at the time had this three-level class system. And as I mentioned, this really only can emerge when agriculture blossoms in the Fertile Crescent. And that is because once people get enough food that they have extra, and once they stay in one area and stop being nomadic and migrating around the environment, once they say, oh yeah, we're going to stay here, we're going to protect these farms, and they save up food year after year. Some people do better than others, some people do worse, and you get wealth inequality. The initial farmers that did very well, maybe they got lucky year after year, maybe they were better at farming, save up their stores of wheat, grains, and maybe hire people to work for them and build a bigger and bigger house. Eventually, this three-level class system emerges where you have poor people and you have rich people, and those people kind of in the middle. And you get cities that also are richer or poorer, larger or smaller. And as I said, the Sumerians were not just in one area, they were very divided into these little city states. So over here, you can see a bunch of these city states. They were very numerous. Each one had a ruler that kind of ruled over the people that lived in the city states, and sometimes they would team up and cooperate together, maybe attack another one. So, take the extra food and animals, take it back. But for the most part, they were very divided. And as I said, this is flexible for them. But we see the Sumerians eventually fall one by one, these cities, because they never unify to defend themselves. The city of Uruk is right over here um, along the Tigris River. And this is the setting for the Epic of Gilgamesh. So a lot of my students ask me, so was this based on a real dude? Was this a real guy? Yes and no. So there probably was, at least archaeologists tell us this, a king of Uruk named Gilgamesh. And he probably did have many of the qualities that we can see uh, in him in the story. But there's some fantastic things, no spoilers, that happened to Gilgamesh in the story that, of course, we wouldn't say it happened historically. So, Sumerians, as I said, they were able to spread their culture, despite the fact that they were divided up like this. They didn't ever unify. All of these peoples, all these city states, had very similar stories, myths, beliefs about the gods, life and death, and they their beliefs would influence cultures beyond those in Sumeria and kind of spread all along the Fertile Crescent into other areas. And this is where we see them uh, producing a belief that we call a polytheistic belief. This means they believed in many gods. You may have heard of the Greeks. They had Athena, gods Zeus, all these different gods. Are the Vikings are like this is well, we have Odin and Thor, many different gods with all different personalities. And this is what we see with the Sumerians. They had many different ones. And in the Epic of Gilgamesh, you're going to see some of these gods. The gods are very interesting in this story because what they present to us is certain archetypes. So when you're reading about these gods, they may seem kind of mysterious or weird to you, but they really have important parallels to characters that we love or maybe hate in things like The Lord of the Rings, or the Avengers, Infinity War, or Endgame. You're going to see some very important character features in these gods. And in most cultures, when we get pantheons of gods, multiple gods, the gods have supernatural abilities. They can do things that normal humans can't do, but they have very human personalities. Beyond the gods, we see that the ancient Sumerians didn't believe in an afterlife. And this is very, very important. When you read about uh, some things that happened to Gilgamesh, you'll see that he has some very intense emotional struggles, and it has to do with his belief or lack thereof of an afterlife. So they didn't believe, oh yeah, we're gonna go off to heaven and everything's gonna be cool. They believed you die and you're gone. The gods kind of can go on existing forever, but people don't have that ability. So when people die in the Epic of Gilgamesh, you'll see that the characters get very upset, and it's related to this belief. And throughout the course, we're going to talk about what beliefs in the afterlife mean to the living. This is what's the most important to. A lot of people think, oh, funerals or beliefs in the afterlife are most important to the dead. But really, anthropologists and archaeologists show it means the most to the living. And we'll talk about why that is throughout the semester. So a couple of gods that you'll bump into on your journey yourself, reading the story. Anu, the father of the gods. He's a guy that's very similar to the Greek god Zeus. He's like a big daddy god. He's strong. He's bearded. He's kind of gruff. He's somebody maybe to be a little bit scared of, but you gotta respect. We'll see another god, Enlil, god of the air. We'll see Utu, a sun god. Sun gods in cultures around the world are often benevolent gods, gods that people look up to. Utu is a lord of truth and justice, and anthropologists and archaeologists have theorized that people are interested or they like sun gods because the sun is so important, specifically to agriculture. People intrinsically knew that the sun was the reason why um, agricultural seasons could be successful certain times of the year versus not successful in other times of the year. Here's another very important thing that it's a little bit hard to understand from the story. There's a lot of descriptions of what their cities were like, what their buildings and architecture were like, but when I read it, I didn't get a good picture of it. But archaeologists have done excavations, done reconstructions, and I have a little virtual reality Gilgamesh museum, which you'll have the option of visiting. You can see these yourself. But they're talking about these gigantic structures called ziggurats, which are these huge temples that existed at the center of their cities. These are Sumerian cities. And they are amazingly large and not easy to put together. This is something that you would have to have thousands of people, but also advanced mathematics to be able to put one of them together. These ziggurats are, we can call them terraced temples. So the pyramids in Egypt just go straight up, and we know they were put there to bury people. There was people buried inside of these. You're not supposed to get on top of it. A good place to stand on top of a pyramid. Anyways, these big giant structures were almost as big as pyramids in some cases, were meant to get on top of. They were meant to be temples where people could perform ritual actions. And when you're building a gigantic temple for people to actually use, you have to build steps that work well to go up and down. It takes a lot of math to make sure you get these right, to make sure that they don't fall over. You have to build terraces, platforms for people to gather. You have to think about how people are going to see this, how it's going to be perceived. There's interior spaces, there's exterior spaces, and they have to have, as I mentioned, lots of people to do this, lots of mathematics to do this, but also lots and lots of planning. We can see around the world. Building a big giant architecture takes a lot of math, but also science, and also calendars. And we see that in Sumerian culture, they are able to develop an advanced mathematical system, so advanced that they had the concept of zero. Any of you math majors out there, you might know why that's important. And also the Pythagorean theorem. So they were able to really plan these things out. It wasn't wasn't just like, oh, let's go set something up here in the desert, make it bigger and bigger and bigger. These were well put together buildings, so well put together that they could be found thousands of years later by archaeologists. And most of them are made from mud brick. So they were building these more or less out of bricks. The Sumerians also had the world's first writing system, at least that we know about. And this is why we have this legend, this tale, dating back so far. This is a huge, huge achievement. And archaeologists theorize that it takes a certain level for societies to produce writing. This means that you have to be successful enough in your farming endeavors, successful enough at defending your cities from other raiders, that you can have a class of people, a group of people that would have enough money, enough food, that they could sit around all day, develop math, and develop writing systems, but also that they could teach other people that were part of this class how to read and how to write. And the way that they did it was on wet clay tablets. So they'd get clay, they'd flatten it out, and they'd inscribe it in there. If you go over to the Penn Museum, they have a great little section on ancient Sumeria, and you can see some of these things. They're very fantastic, and you're quite lucky to be able to actually go and check out some of the stuff if you are actually over here in Philadelphia. And so we see the Epic of Gilgamesh was written down this way. It was the first work of fiction ever recorded, and it was etched on a huge amount of these tablets. So, as I mentioned, this is something that my students ask me about, and it's something scholars debate. Was there an actual Gilgamesh? What separates the fact from the fiction? What was myth and what was reality? And yes, once you get done reading it, you'll be like, there's some things that are just so fantastic. They couldn't have happened. It wouldn't be possible. But with all myths, there is usually some grain of truth. So, as I mentioned, there was actually a king Gilgamesh that ruled in the Sumerian dynasty in Uruk in 2700 BCE. And we know this because there is, and you can see this at the Penn Museum too, there are these clay tablets that were inscribed with the kingly names, a list of rulers. Let me see if I could find it. It's really cool, and I have a version in my Gilgamesh museum. Gilgamesh. Pull up Google here. Yep, I will show you one of them. Add an overlay. Give me a second. Hold on, I'm trying out this new app here that my screen's my selection. You can see it here. I've got it kind of right in the middle here. You can see here, and what this is one of these tablets. And they would inscribe, it's very hard to read. Some of them are very difficult to read, very small text. But they created tablets with the list of kings. Beautiful, beautiful artwork, everything like that. This is a possible, or to see here on the right, this is a possible depiction of Gilgamesh. This is actually the man himself. Uh, it could be a sculpture, an artistic representation. We're not exactly sure, but yeah, I thought that would be neat to look at. So the legend or the Epic of Gilgamesh is important for many reasons. But one of the first reasons that it became important to the Sumerians is because they found that people, other cultures around them, liked it. It was popular. And how do we know this? We can see that it became adopted. We see versions of the Epic of Gilgamesh with small changes, sometimes large changes, being adopted by different cultures. Even far after the Sumerian people, the Sumerian culture kind of disintegrates. Let me go back. We see versions of it in the Akkadian culture, the Hittite culture, the Babylonian culture, and arguably we even see bits of it in the Bible. There's parts of Epic of Gilgamesh that discuss a great flood. Of course, a flood would be very important to these people that lived between these rivers and depended on a yearly flood event for their agriculture. But as within anywhere where you're near a big river that floods, flooding can totally get out of control and cause damage and destruction. So one of their stories is focused on a gigantic flood event that kind of wipes things out, changes the world dramatically. We see a dramatic flood event in many cultures, in the stories and myths of many cultures at this time. Since many people were worried about floods, but we also see flood events in cultures much later. I'm specifically referring to the Great Flood in the Bible, the story of Noah, God coming down and flooding the whole world, and gets into the boat, saves the animals. It's argued that this may have been influenced by the Sumerian stories of flooding. It seems like all the people living in the Fertile Crescent area, archaeologists have found, anthropologists have also recognized, all the people living in this area had some kind of flood event story. That points to the fact maybe they all dealt with a big flood, it actually happened, or it points to the fact they were actually all dealing with big floods that happened in their areas. One of the other theories is that there could have been a huge flood event where the Black Sea overfilled and flooded all the people out here, like where my laser pointer is going. It's debated on what the reason for this is, but nonetheless, it seems like the Epic of Gilgamesh was very influential to these cultures in terms of kind of character that Gilgamesh was, the kind of things that he dealt with, the kinds of big events like floods. And we'll see that Epic of Gilgamesh becomes influential in a sort of structural, cognitive way, even to modern times, even to our modern idea of what a hero is, what a hero should be. So, yes, as I mentioned, the Epic of Gilgamesh, the Sumerian people would go on to influence many other cultures. Most directly, uh, they the Sumerians go on to influence kind of these cultures in a chain, like you could see over here: the Akkadians, the Hittites, the Babylonians, Syrians, and each culture kind of modifies the myth more and more, and it becomes very, very different by the time we get to the Assyrian people in 700, 600 BC. If you're curious about any of these cultures, of course, you can go to Wikipedia and look any of them up, very easy. Or you could play the game Age of Empires. Yeah, Age of Empires has these cultures in there. Really cool game. So, Epic of Gilgamesh, very important work. It's important by virtue of just how old it is. It's the earliest book. It's the earliest myth that we have written down, the earliest New York Times bestseller. Not New York Times, but ancient Sumerian times, ancient Uruk times bestseller. And it's very important also because it has maybe the first version of this great flood story, the story that seems to resonate with people all throughout the Middle East. It also is the earliest story where you see a character that is called in the Epic of Gilgamesh Utnapishtim, who survives this great flood, which is very similar to that dude in the Bible named Noah who survives it, and he's he's a character that has many parallels to Noah. And when we look at this story, it's not just important because it's old, but it gives us insight into the values of the civilization. And you could read the story without knowing anything about the archaeology and kind of try to decode it symbolically and say, oh, this is what was important to them. I think by knowing what was going on in the ancient world while kind of considering their values at the same time, you can get a lot more from the story. So you have to think about it this way when you're reading it. The people that had written the Epic of Gilgamesh were an early civilization. They lived in this world where they had kings, they had uh, they had discovered this technology to grow crops. They had to deal with floods. They had to deal with people raiding. They had to hide behind walls for safety. They had gods that would protect them sometimes didn't care about them. And they had no afterlife. They had this very difficult existence. And when people have a difficult existence, they focus on things that are important to them in their mythology. So that's what you're going to look for. You're going to try to think about when you're reading it, what was important to these people, given all these facts. So you're going to see things such as divine retribution for transgressions, such as violence, pride, and oppression of others. So divine retribution means that gods will come down and smite you or spank you if you're an asshole, if you're violent to your fellow person, if you are too prideful. The gods are going to get you for it. And you have to think about, why are they talking about that? They're talking about that because they're trying to tell people how they should live, what they should do in their life, how they should live together. So there are going to be things in the Epic Gilgamesh that are kind of hard to read, particularly in the beginning. Gilgamesh seems like a huge asshole, pardon my French. He's mean to people, he hurts people, he's selfish. They're giving us this character to show us what we're not supposed to do, how we should live our life in this difficult to survive in world. You need walls. You need to pray to the gods to make sure you get enough rain and water for your plants. So you could just live this life because there's not going to be any other life afterwards, no afterlife. And you're dealing with the stresses of floods in the natural world. So when life is that difficult, when there's this many things going on, it's hard to survive. You have to focus on what's important to you. So think about that when you're reading it. What was important to these people? And you may say, oh, my world is so different. I don't have to worry about these same things. We'll see that the things that were important to them, many of the things that were the most important to them are also still important to us. And I argue that is why this myth resonates thousands and thousands of years later. We could see also, and as I said, Epic of Gilgamesh really has a ton of similarities to contemporary stories that people love, the most popular stories. He is an archetype of, the character Gilgamesh is an archetype of a modern day hero. So when you're reading it, maybe in your head you could imagine him to look like Tony Stark, like a huge buff bearded Tony Stark from Iron Man. He has almost the same exact character arc, actually, as Tony Stark from the first Iron Man movie all the way up to when he dies later. He goes through this period where he's a shallow, vapid, mean kind of person, and eventually has to transform himself to become a hero, to become Iron Man, to become this legend that people write about thousands of years later. And we're going to talk about this, I think, a little bit more on Tuesday. We'll watch a short little video. The similarities in myths were noted by this guy Joseph Campbell, who wrote about how the most important myths to people around the world have the same exact structures, the same exact archetypes, and that there is a reason for this. There is a reason for these similarities. There is a reason for the parallels. And this reason has to do with us expressing the most important values. And it just so happens that although cultures have different beliefs around the world, the things that make us human across time and space. But also they express what we think about our lives, about our existence as a whole. So we see that there are, as I mentioned, parallels to the Avengers, Lord of the Rings, Star Wars, but also the famous myths like the Odyssey and other Greek epics, and most of the stories that we're going to read later. So when you're looking at Gilgamesh, and we're going to look at Joseph Campbell's work also, look at him, like I said, kind of like Tony Stark, maybe Bruce Wayne, Batman, even Harry Potter. You can look at them, you can look at Gilgamesh as a hero that is going on a quest. And there are things that happen in the quest that transform him as a person in the same way as Tony Stark or Luke Skywalker or Batman. They usually have something special, and I'm giving you the basic archetypes that are used. They have something about their birth or their familial origin that can be very uncommon or a little bit uncommon. It's something usually kind of interesting. And there's usually some mystery kind of involved. And like all of our superhero movies, they have extraordinary powers. They don't have to be superpowers, but their abilities can make them extraordinary. So the most popular hero stories They don't have to have powers, like Batman doesn't have powers, but he has very extraordinary abilities. They also have a tragic flaw or weakness. Every hero has their limitations, something that makes them vulnerable. And it doesn't just have to be something like Superman. Superman is vulnerable to kryptonite, this green crystal substance. It's the only thing that really hurts Superman. It can be something about their personality that is their weakness. So look for Gilgamesh's weakness when you're reading about it, and think about what his weakness is telling us. What the Mesopotamians were trying to say. They all go through a rite of passage. Every hero goes through tests and training to prove themselves. So you can imagine in countless films that there's always a scene where the hero is transformed from normal guy or normalish guy to the hero that they will become. In The Matrix, for example, Neo goes and does kung fu with Morpheus. In Iron Man, he gets trapped in a cave and he has to build his own suit of armor and escape. Uh, in every hero story, there's always an, a form of transformation. They go from normal to heroic. Luke Skywalker goes in Star Wars to train with Yoda and learns the Jedi powers. In addition to that, every hero has a nemesis, a villain, and usually that villain is very similar to the hero. It's like a dark alternate version. And some people complain that the Marvel movies that the villains are always just kind of there, that they're just kind of a copy of every other movie, and it's true, but it's because they're following the formula that Epic of Gilgamesh set forward. Every hero movie, for the most part, follows this formula, and that's why the villain is always some kind of dark version of the hero. Sometimes it's more interesting than other times, depending on the movie. And we always see with hero movies that they achieve their destiny. The hero achieves his or her destiny and they can find success. That means that there's a happy ending. The way that ending occurs is different, but they find success in the end. So, spoiler alert, there's going to be some success at the end of Gilgamesh. But the way that they get to that success, different cultures reflect on differently. So, when we get to the end of Gilgamesh, we're going to really reflect on what that means to Gilgamesh, what it meant to the Mesopotamian. Also, we see that heroes stand for good. That's why they're hero. They are morally and principally a good character. And yes, they can have momentary weakness, or maybe they start off kind of bad. Gilgamesh definitely starts off kind of bad, but that's part of their transformation, that they can either learn to be good or they can learn to transcend their moment of weakness. So there's a lot for you to chew on there. And I'm going to bring myself up here so you guys can just see me. Yeah.